Donc, si vous voulez l'utiliser, le bouton est disponible sur la barre en bas à droite. Pour tout entendre ce qui va se passer aujourd'hui en français, il faut cliquer sur French. So we do have simultaneous interpretation available today. If you'd like to hear everything in English today, all you have to do is click the button on the bottom right of your bar and select English. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Zoe.
Hello, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Oui. Oh, sorry. I just got disoriented by the spotlighting. All of a sudden, my face was very large. Do you mind spotlighting Ron as well? Ron, hi. How was your trip?
Real good.
Awesome. It's great to see your face again. So I just wanted to check in about recording. Do you prefer if we don't record the opening?
No, sure.
It's okay to record it? Awesome. Okay. And I think you were going to talk a bit about the Peace and Friendship Alliance as well, maybe? Okay. Awesome. So we have figured, like, obviously things are so much nicer in person when we can make that happen. But since we can't, this is the digital approximation. So I have a tobacco here in cloth, and I'm really grateful to be offering this to you in exchange for the opening ceremony today. And then I'll mail it to you.
Actually, when could we the amsquas welcome to you the Billy Gisk? Could we archo yag you genzoswag? What edle begolted Jibanog zonesnog guskiasnog latag westnog? Could we batche mag medjabal you chkobazig naga najabligaki minen and massinaminen? Gigi hinen at loose good go walking macweg out. Could we now well to moak chinig was and skik to make what the bossy lumcake knit the atag nid samago na is good naga go walk tapkwan naga samagwan naga did I need atag Pamausawagan, you could not ski Joe. Could we was well to Muag Wajawal, Naga Jikol, Naga Sida you Edligok, Mijawaganal, Naga Pizonal, Naga Nick Needle Zamagwanal, Zebel Seasel, Wispamal, Zebegil. Good will was a welcome walk up to the way sees the juju cheesing the mass with zip sees it to come out so we're going to gillow. If you're back it on your gillow, you'd stick a good at a good skick to make the mugwani gonna go what was a gist cook. Good we now was a welcome walk. Most of us we Westpadau said, no was we Nebo said. And the meat talks with Mozigisk, like on the Massy, like on the Hazis, like what says I'm like what's pumpkin, it'll be gold teed. Lay one chop, sit there of a mouse wagon, it was sit there of a mouse wagon, chitpit, need lage. I will now translate what I said in my Wolastoqewi language. First and foremost, I invited the ancestors who dwell in the east, in the south, in the west, in the north, to come and guide us today, to teach us and to heal us as we walk this good red road, and to help to protect Mother Earth and the air and all of life. I also thank our great Mother Earth from her center core, where that lava is and all the layers of earth and shale, and that the aquifers of water and all of life that is below our feet, and that sustains life below our feet. And here on the surface of the earth, I thank the mountains and the forests and all the food and the medicine that grow, and also all the animals, the four-legged, the flyers, the crawlers, and the swimmers, as well as all the water, the waterways, the rivers, the brooks, the lakes, the streams, the oceans, the marshes, for their life. And I thank the above world, where our grandfather's sun walks through the sky during the daytime, our grandmother moon walks through the sky at night, and our sisters and brothers, the stars, and our great father, sky. And I thank them for all of life, and as they look down upon us. And I said at the end that all life is sacred. And I said, nidlage, 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 nidlage. That means let that be so, let that be the truth, let that be so, let that be the truth. Let that be so, and let that be the truth. So that's my thoughts of gratitude to all of life, and bringing forth this this gathering, this virtual gathering. Now I was asked to talk a little bit about the Peace and Friendship Alliance group, and how it all started. Back during the time, I think it was 2013, when there was a threat of fracking here in our homelands. First, it started off in Wolastoqewi here in our homeland, up near Stanley, that they had thumper trucks up there testing for any natural gas, and they were and I don't know if you all know what a thumper truck is. I think that there was 5 of them, and what they do is they actually drive along and on a road, and then there's certain distance between them, and they lower this huge heavy magnetized portion of their truck underneath, and they shake the earth, and then they have these monitors up and down the road, and they try to get a reading whether there's natural gas in between the shale beneath the surface of the earth, and that this is how they gauge and regulate and get readings from whether there's natural gas there or not. So while they were transporting these vehicles, that we actually started a group, the anti-fracking group. Back at the time, there was quite a few various organizations involved at the time, and we, as the Wolastoqey Grand Council, was part of that, as well as many different organizations. I think that was also the birth of the Canadian, the Council of Canadians here in Fredericton. So it was, so they formed a group of Council of Canadians here. So we joined them. There was a young man who was studying to be a doctor, and there was, in fact, there was lawyers. There was various, farmers, and there was just regular people, retired people. And I remember there was an older couple there that lived up in Stanley, and I remember talking to the elder lady, and I'm so sorry that I can't remember her name, but she was just a wonderful person. She said, I'm a grandmother, and I think she was a great grandmother at the time. She said, I never dreamt in my life that I'd be standing on a road blocking thumper trucks from going forward. She said, I'm very quiet, and I don't like any conflict, but when our water is in threat, that she would, and she was thinking about her children and her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. So she said, I never dreamt that I'd be doing something like this in my lifetime. So that was the birth of this whole organization. And then as time went on, as you might have all either read or seen or heard of, the Louise-Comeau crisis, when they were going around there doing the readings from those thumper trucks and so on. So it kind of between 2013 and 2015, we would meet monthly on a regular basis. So we kind of threw around some names, and our good friend Joan Green had suggested, geez, how why don't we call it the Peace and Friendship Alliance? Because we are governed under the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 17, 25, and 26. And we agreed to be friends according to those treaties. And if you read those treaties in detail, there was never surrender of lands nor resources. But as we know, as time went on from 2000 or 1726, is that the majority of our land were stolen, as well as the resources. And then our people were displaced and put on reservations where they regulated our people's movements and what we did and what we couldn't do. And there's still an act called the Indian Act that actually governs our people with these prehistoric laws to regulate our peoples. So from that whole movement, the fracking and when we stood up to protect the land and the water and all the flora and the fauna, is that the birth of the Peace and Friendship Alliance came. And it was and this was pre-COVID. We would meet regularly, usually monthly or every second month. And then usually it would be hosted by either communities or villages. And then we would go and support one another and just to update one another in what was going around within our townships or villages, cities, and so on. So this was quite an active group pre-COVID, and a lot of us who are on the Peace and Friendship Alliance group were totally supportive of the Louise-Comeau Mi'kmaq people who stood up against the fracking, as well as their neighbors, the Francophone people from around that area, supported us. And I don't know, I can't remember who said this, but I remember I believe it was a Francophone person who said this. He said they said little did the government and this corporation SWIN know that they brought together for the first time indigenous people who are the Wabanagi and the Francophones and the Anglophones people together, and they joined us together in force, and we stood up to protect the earth and the water and the air. And he said they didn't realize how powerful our unity would be. And we actually stopped the fracking during that time period. And there's a memorandum actually that was written by the Liberal Party at the time, because I believe it was the Conservative Party who were in power when the fracking was was brought into our homelands. And then quickly, when the elections came, the Liberal Party had promised that they would put a moratorium, not a memorandum, moratorium against fracking. And then a lot of the people who vote in the provincial election voted for the Liberals at the time, and they fulfilled their promise. So as we all know, that the present Higgs government is actually talking about dissolving that that piece of policy that's protecting our homelands, and he's talking about bringing back fracking and the testing and so on. So as the Peace and Friendship Alliance, we have not met in quite a few, in fact, in 2.5 years, but we've been still in contact through the emails and so on, and talking to one another. We support the stop spraying of glyphosate. We've supported the not for the East Coast pipeline. We supported not to have that built and put through our homelands and so on. So and there's always a constant struggle, and we're always on the defense, be it deforestation, monoculture, and so on. So I think that's basically what I want to say about the peace and friendship. And hopefully in the summer, when the nicer weather comes, that we can meet once again in person, and we can talk about rebuilding the Alliance group again. So unless there's any questions, I think I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. That was so lovely. We are so grateful to have you here. And I think hearing the history of the Peace and Friendship Alliance is such a great way to ground us in the past work that we've done, but also the future work that needs to be done. Thank you again for that. I would love to see thank yous to Ron in the chat as well. So as we continue on with our event today, I would like to remind everyone that we do have interpretation available if you joined us late. So to use that, once again, all you have to do is click the little button in the bottom right of your screen and select English to hear everything in English. Donc, j'aimerais vous rappeler encore une fois qu'on a de l'interprétation simultanée aujourd'hui. Donc, pour diffuser, tout ce qu'il faut faire, c'est cliquer sur le petit bouton en bas à droite sur votre écran et sélectionner French ou français. I will be primarily speaking in English, not in English, sorry, in French. Donc, je vais parler en français pour la plupart d'aujourd'hui. Donc, pour ceux qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Annika Kci-Sakom, et je suis la directrice générale du réseau environnemental du Nouveau-Brunswick. Je connais beaucoup de vous qui sont ici avec nous aujourd'hui, mais ça fait plaisir de voir des nouveaux visages. J'aimerais également remercier André et Adrien qui font l'interprétation pour nous aujourd'hui. Qui font l'interprétation pour nous aujourd'hui. Et je veux aussi également reconnaître ma superbe équipe qui est ici avec moi et qui facilite cet événement aujourd'hui, dont Zahira Denaf, notre coordinatrice du programme du collectif sur l'adaptation au changement climatique. Si tu veux dire allô, Zahira? Oh.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay with my audio today.
No problem, Zahira. Zomi Jazwicki? responsable des programmes d'éducation à la vivalité. Sadia Ara, coordinatrice des programmes de santé environnementale. Doris Pinet, réseautrice au nord-est de la province. Shannon Richard, assistante au projet et aux communications. Jordan Kilgore, coordinatrice de l'Alliance pour l'éducation à la vivalité. Lily Bearclough, coordinatrice de projet pour l'initiative de recherche et connaissances. Nathalie Gauguin, coordinatrice des programmes de biodiversité et bassin versant. Et également Jacinda Lefebvre, qui est notre comptable et qui n'est pas ici avec nous aujourd'hui, mais qui fait quand même partie de l'équipe. Et avant de commencer, je vais aussi signaler que les présentations d'aujourd'hui seront enregistrées, mais la GA ne le sera pas. Donc, si vous ne voulez pas apparaître dans l'enregistrement, vous pouvez éteindre votre caméra. Donc, j'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que la plupart d'entre nous qui sont ici aujourd'hui, qui participent à l'appel, se retrouvent sur les terres traditionnelles non cédées des peuples Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqewi et Passamaquoddy. Je demande que nous saisissons tous cette occasion pour réfléchir à notre relation avec la Terre et au processus continu de colonisation et décolonisation qui a un impact profond sur notre travail, donc le travail des activistes et des environnementalistes. Les concepts de la vision à 2 yeux, donc two-eyed seeing, la planification sur 7 générations et d'autres formes de connaissances traditionnelles autochtones sont essentiels pour assurer un avenir durable à notre planète. J'appelle également nos gouvernements colonisateurs à respecter leurs obligations en vertu de la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Nous devons reconnaître que les droits ont été dépouillés et niés à l'aide des lois et politiques fondées sur des doctrines juridiques telles que la terra nullius qui déclarait cette terre vide, malgré la présence des peuples autochtones. En reconnaissant la terre, nous posons un petit geste de résistance contre l'effacement continu des peuples autochtones et de leurs droits inhérents. Donc, je vous invite à nous dire sur quel territoire vous êtes dans le chat également. Donc, aujourd'hui, à l'ordre du jour, et nous sommes un peu à l'avance de notre temps, on va commencer notre journée avec une présentation de Kopit Lodge sur comment on peut appuyer la souveraineté autochtone au Nouveau-Brunswick. Elle sera suivie d'une petite pause de 10 minutes, ou peut-être un petit peu plus longtemps puisqu'on a un peu de temps, qui sera suivie par 2 présentations. La première étant de Susan O'Donnell et Louise Comeau sur les choix énergétiques et l'action climatique au Nouveau-Brunswick. La deuxième sera de Mike Kofahl de East Coast Environmental Law, qui va nous parler des politiques et la protection des côtes au Nouveau-Brunswick. Puis nous aurons une autre petite pause, puis ça sera l'Assemblée générale annuelle qui se terminera avec la cérémonie de remise des prix du RENB. Donc, on va finir notre journée vers 16h30. Chaque présentation a une période de questions et réponses. Donc, nous vous encourageons d'utiliser la fonction chat ou d'utiliser la fonction lever la main pour poser vos questions. C'est Zomi qui va s'assurer de collectionner toutes les questions à travers la journée. We are very happy to have Alex Levi here with us today. Donc, on est très heureux d'avoir Alex Levi avec nous aujourd'hui, qui va nous parler de ce qu'ils font à Kopit Lodge. Ça va être une conversation très informelle, donc sentez-vous libre de mettre vos questions dans le chat à travers de sa conversation. Puis, on va aller de l'avant. Alex, the floor is yours.
Oh, so it's me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
Sorry,
So
I probably went too fast there.
no, I just didn't know if you were going to say anything else. That's all. So I want to say thank you. Walalio dan Baji Bisquali Aktet and Baji Galuzi Uchidelsi Buklugat Nigama. I just want to say thank you for asking me to come in here today and to speak to you about my people and about what we're doing in my community. It's a great honor, and I take a great deal of pride in having the ability to talk. So I think probably the best thing would be is to kind of introduce myself a little bit and what exactly I do and what Kopit Lodge is. So Kopit Lodge is we were established in 2013 with the speaker, which is Kenneth Francis, who's my boss. They started Kopit Lodge when shale gas had started in New Brunswick. This was a while back. And improper consultation had happened for my community, which is Elsipogtog, which is in New Brunswick, Canada. And slow me down if I go too fast. And so the chief and council directed Kenneth and the board to start this consultation group. And so we started then. And so when we started, things didn't work out as well for us. That the federal and the provincial governments and proponents weren't really engaging in trying to get our approval or permission for the activities that happen on our lands. And that strives from shale gas all the way to forestry and fisheries and all other things in between. So in 2016, the chief, which is the current chief now, Aaron Sock, and Kenneth filed for title in New Brunswick. And so they went back into the historical districts that we had. We had 7 districts, and the one that we live in is called District 6. In what is known, like we call it Signiktug, which is what is known as New Brunswick now, and we used to call New Brunswick Mi'kmaq. We still call it that, but that was the ancestral name. So when we filed in, we kind of gave the federal and provincial governments, no other avenues but to engage us on our traditional territories. So that started the process. So I started here in early 2020. I was a consultant before that. So I did consultation for First Nations all across Canada. Worked on several different projects for them and whatnot. So fortunately, I was hired in my own home community in 2020 to come help with this particular title claim. And so there's several title claims. There's like, and I'm just kind of want to give you an idea or give everybody an idea on what exactly. So there's a specific land claim where that refers to indigenous people losing access and the ability to have historical lands and access. And so that's resources and that's activities, fishing, hunting, gathering, all these other things. And that's like you go into negotiations with the federal government or the provincial government on receiving, getting payment for loss of access. And there's and then there's a title claim, which is what we did. So we filed for title claim, and that we filed for basically self-governance and jurisdiction over our traditional territory. And so the reason why I was asked to speak today is because we are in that particular negotiation right now with Canada and us in asserting our governance and jurisdiction and sovereignty over our traditional territory. And why it kind of coincides with what the talks have been, will be for the day, is that, we're trying to bring back our traditional, traditional way of life. Not all of it, but like the 7 generational thinking, which is incredibly important for our title claim, that we, have this style of thinking where we don't think about what just is going to make us happy right now or rich right now. We have this mindset of what will be available for our future generations, and that's 7 generational thinking is what we call it. There's been other people that look at it as a kind of like a 2-eyed seeing approach, which is very similar to what we do. It's kind of having the modern and the traditional way to foresee the future and for insurable resources and all this other thing. Sorry, hold on. Yeah. Okay. So what we're doing at the lodge now is that we're trying to we're working with federal government and in the process of trying to work with the provincial government to have a co-management system. And for us, it's not about trying to, we've had difficulties in the province of New Brunswick where Premier Higgs is kind of I don't, he had a style of thinking that, that we're going to come in here and we're going to take people's land. And, this is the historical land of the Mi'kmaq and the Passamaquoddy and the Wolastoqewi people. So it's, it's a very different style of thinking and approach, and where people would get scared here thinking that we're going to come take our land back and this and that, and, evict people. And that's, it's not what we're trying to do. We're trying very much to create harmony and balance with the decisions that happen in our lands and resources, where, if there's things that are going to happen in our traditional territories that are not beneficial for everybody, and that are not, there's no ability to, let's say, mitigate or ensure the longevity of the future of our resources, whether it's forestry or fisheries or mining or shale gas, anything like that, that it's not acceptable for us, because we're the ones that, live off the land, and we're the ones that historically protected. We've been, here since time immemorial, and we took a great deal of pride of being a part of this land. There's a lot of history here that people don't know about, and people, it's not told in books. It's not told in classrooms. Our way of teaching and passing things down are very, are through our words, and passed down through stories and knowledge. And that's our history. Like, our history is verbal, it's not written. So, when we have the fortunate ability to share our stories with, with anybody that's willing to listen, whether it's indigenous or not, we try to take the time to make sure that you understand our point of view on what we're trying to do and what we're trying to protect. So I feel like this whole movement of having, green style of thinking is very good, but we also have to be very mindful of it, because it has to have balance. It has to, it's you have to have good with the bad, but you have to be able to balance things out. Now and that's the struggle that we go with, understanding there's forestry and there's ways of, things that need to happen, but there's also better ways to do it, where, it's renewable. It's not just one type of tree being replanted, and it's not, it's not always the same areas. Like, so there's ways to do things, and that's our approach on what we're trying to do, and what we've been trying to accomplish with the work we do at the lodge. So it's a very unique approach. It's very different, and I have I've had this question of, from the province and from other places, where they ask, it's what's our connection to this land? Why do these First Nations, why do these indigenous people love the land so much? Why? And the best way I can explain it is that, we've been here since time immemorial, and we have a certain type of, like, I shouldn't say we, I don't need to speak for all of them, but this is my interpretation, this is what I should say. The way I see it is that we've been in this land for so long that there's one thing that we know, is that we're born of this land, and then when we die, we return to the land. And when we do that, this is, you become you join your ancestors, and we have a great deal of pride of being, hoping that, the ancestors will answer the questions, and we'll create a good relationship with them when they pass on. But these ancestors also provide us with everything that we need. That's why there's so much connection to the land and so much protection, applied to our resources, is because those trees, those fish, those animals, that all comes from our ancestors, because when they laid their lives down and they went back to the earth, it brings back life, it brings back this balance, and it helps provide that. And we respect it that much. We take a great deal of pride of making sure that it's, that it's going to be renewable, it's going to be ongoing, because we know at the end of the day, we're going to go back to the earth. And then someday we'll be the ancestors to sit there and help our future generations. And whether it's hunting or fishing or getting medicines or, being, a tree, a rock, whatever it may be, we're going to be giving back. And so this is our connection. This is what I foresee anyways with the land, and how I can explain it best for people to understand what exactly we see and why we see it this way. And I've been fortunate enough to be in consultation from Nova Scotia all the way over to BC, as far up as you know, the Northwest Territories. And, you know, I've seen a lot of things. I've talked to a lot of my people, and I've been fortunate enough to hear their stories, you know, about reconciliation, about all these other things. And, you know, the one thing that always tends to heal them and always tends to bring things back for them is land. You know, it's going back to the land. It's going back to nature. It's, you know, understanding yourself again. It's understanding whether you're a gatherer, a storyteller, you know, a knowledge keeper, a hunter, a fisher. You know, we don't look, we tend not to look at ourselves as individuals, as more as a community. Is that's the individual. That's the human being. You know, we that's the one thing we're seeking, is to be treated like human beings. And everybody in the community has a role in one way, you know, one way, shape, or form. Whether it's a leadership or whether it's, you know, a hunter, an educator, you know, you're all a cell in a body, and you all have a certain role to do, right? Oh, is there a question here? I'm sorry.
I can read it out if that helps.
Yeah. So
That
Everyone-
can wait. That can wait. I didn't want to interrupt you. I just thought for after.
no, all right. Well, I mean, yeah, and so like, and I just, you know, so a lot of people here know, if you know, everybody's environmental group or some kind of consultation, like this is, you know, this is real life stuff. Like this is what we deal, and that's how I see it. Like the communities are beings, and everybody has a job, and if we all do it, like it's very functional. It's very tight knit, and it achieves things that are, you know, that are amazing, and it's an everyday thing. You know, for my community, like when shale gas started, they, you know, they got together and they stopped something that nobody thought we were going to be able to stop. So there's amazing things that come from this. And so I guess this is why I bring into the idea of you know, our assertion of title and claim over our land, is that, you know, we don't get consulted. We don't get the level of interest and, you know, governance that should be, you know, allotted to First Nations people. And it's different across the, you know, across Canada or across North America. But to me, like it's about collaboration, and it's about, you know, co-developing, you know, mandates or progress or whatever it may be. You know, there's a lot of things that happen here, but, and I'm not saying in any way that we can fix it all, like that it's all on us. Like, no, it's about, oh, sorry. I thought he said something. I'm sorry. So, yeah, so I just kind of like, it's not an easy fix or one size fits all. It's a process. And this is what we're trying to achieve with our particular table and what happens to be going on here. You know, we've had a lot of great things. We had a lot of bad things. But we're moving in a direction that is, you know, that just doesn't speak to, you know, just one particular class of people or one type of people. Like, you know, for us, it's we call ourselves a grassroots organization where we think about, you know, traditional way of life and the new way of life as well. But, you know, we try to encompass everybody's opinion and everybody's voice, and they have the ability and they have the right to speak it. You know, and when you take that away from our people, that's wrong. You know, it's you know, they have the right to show their concerns and their opinions, and, you know, we have to find a way to do this in a, you know, it may not be a consensus, but we have to try the best way and to ensure the longevity and, you know, of Mother Earth. You know, just today, like in New Brunswick, we're having storms coming in, and, you know, the tide surge that comes in from these storms, even in the winter, are you know, very, very noticeable. You know, our bridges now, where our piers have you know, they have several levels. Well, they're almost to the bottom of the bridges now, and it's a normal occurrence. You know, I'm not that old, but, you know, 20 years ago, that never happened. You know, so things are changing very quickly, you know, and the time is that, you know, it's running out for us, and where we have to make some very noticeable changes on how we approach things and how we do things. So it's not too late, but, you know, we have to take time. So this is just, you know, this is our version of trying to help with whatever we can and help approach what we can. and to include, you know, indigenous knowledge and history and techniques to help. So question.
So I might just read out the questions so that they get translated as well, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
So the first question is, everyone here belongs to an environmental group. We know about the government's duty to consult. Do you see any duty to consult by environmental groups when we plan projects, especially land-based projects or major developments on Indigenous land? If not a duty, and understanding that everyone in Kopit Lodge only has so much time, do you want to be contacted when we're developing projects? And then the follow-up. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Do the follow-up, and then I'll start. No, it's me. My mind just jumps right into it. So I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Do the follow-up.
The question about time is a big one. Kopit Lodge is a small group and they don't get paid enough, in my opinion, to be able to handle hundreds of consultation requests. Are there ways environmental groups can ensure there is advising or consultation without overwhelming you?
Well, you know what? Yeah, there's ways to do this. So I'll jump on the first one. Like, you know, whether it's an environmental group or whether it's a proponent, whether it's, you know, that doesn't really make a difference. I think the best thing I know for us is that we're creating a policy on certain type of things that we want to be engaged on. So we'll have an EIA process where it's an environmental impact, like what the triggers are, like, and it's going to be specific to each file. But there's ways to do this. So if there's a project coming up, like in the true heart of things, it's about collaboration. Like, we do have our own staff, and then we do have consultants we have hired, and we have a legal team. But yeah, we are a small organization, but we prioritize our things. We don't overlook anything. We take the time to look at it, and we have to prioritize it, or kind of like triage the situations on it. What is, you know, we can send in our recommendations. We'll look at it and we'll say, yes, that's okay. Like, we want to be a part of this, or we're willing to support this. Or if it's something that is, you know, that isn't that, you know, somebody putting a new water treatment plant in for a community, like, you know, they have to put a new location. It's like, okay, just, you know, if you find any archaeological findings, let us know. But other than that, we know you need this treatment facility, and what are your plans? What's your remediation for the other one? What's your reclamation process? We ask those little things, and then we just kind of move on with it. But if it's a major project, you know, we have a tendency to bring in, you know, our consultants. We have a tendency to bring in our legal, and we group together as a team, and we like, okay, we've got this coming up. We got this. How can we work this? You know, we try to fit things in. So yeah, but I mean, for me, it's like, the sooner we know and the depth of what the project is, the better. Because at that point in time, we're not trying to catch up. That's our biggest difficulty is when, for example, the province will say, like, well, we're putting in a new bridge. We have to go in like with a month left to do all the assessment, the environmental impact assessment. We have to do a technical review on the whole project. You know, we don't even get a chance to go into and see what plant life's there and whatnot. So that's the times when things are crunched. But, you know, when it's right away and you collab with us, and that's what I mean, like, it's about co-management, and that's co-management of time, space. Like, when you get that, it's way easier. You know what I mean? And that's just speaking from my point of view. But, you know, if I'm sure the other organizations like MTI and WNMB here, it would be like that for them as well. You know, the sooner the better you were involved, and we know what's going on. The consultation process takes off quicker, and we will work together. And, you know, and maybe we can, you know, partner up on a lot of these things that people don't tend to think that we want to, you know. And with those type of things, like, it can create a capacity for us where we can create experts or give job opportunities, or, you know, have development in our communities for our people, to get them more aware and educated about these things, and give them opportunities for jobs. You know, when I started at the lodge, there's two of us. You know, I've got a staff of like four people right now, and we're going to be growing here in the future. But you know, that's a big step for us to have our own people to be invested in and given the opportunity. So yeah, there's good ways to do this, and there's bad ways to do this, right? But I feel like, yeah, there's, you know, early engaged and partner up. And if it's something that we can work together, hell yeah. I'm all for that. If that answers the question.
I think so. That's amazing. So there's a question in the chat and then there's a raised hand. The question in the chat is the New Brunswick government consulting you now on their plans for lifting the shale gas, how do you say it? Shale gas moratorium.
They have reached out. The thing is with their moratorium, they have certain criterias they have to reach prior to lifting their moratorium, and it's written in their own moratorium, like they in their own laws. So it's a discussion that we haven't fully had yet. They've been trying. We've been trying to make sure that we're as Elsipogtog as a community, we're ready for whatever direction they're trying to do this is. We have told them, and I have told them, that if you're planning to force this again, we will stand there and we will be waiting for you when you knock on the door, because we're not going to stand down for this. We did it once, we'll do it again. But if we want to do it in, a very, I don't know how you would say, didn't want to say classy, but I mean, if you want to do it in a very constructive way, we are willing to talk. We're not saying anything other than that, because I don't know what they're proposing. I don't know what they want to do. Like, it seems to me like from an outsider looking in, to me, what I see is just a lot of hearsay of, like, with the war in Russia right now, fuel costs are going up. And so I'm sure it's very tempting for somebody trying to sell natural gas or shale gas to whoever. But even at that, like, it doesn't even have it's not at a great price to sell right now and whatnot. So, it's an interesting conversation. We haven't had that conversation with them yet, but we know that they have criteria before they can lift their moratorium. So if they break that, that's, that's something that they're going to be breaking the rules, and then they'll have to go to court or something like that along that line, I think, if it goes that way. So if that answers your question, Louise. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. And somebody. Sorry, go ahead.
Merci. Là, je vais poser ma question en français. C'est quand vous avez parlé que vous avez eu l'opportunité de faire un peu le tour, puis de parler aussi avec les Premières Nations en Colombie-Britannique. Puis on a eu la chance en octobre d'aller en Colombie-Britannique pour une rencontre, puis où il y avait les Premières Nations. Puis pour moi qui n'est pas d'originaire ici, je trouve ça vraiment assez intéressant. Ça m'a vraiment comme surpris de voir quand même une intégration de la culture autochtone beaucoup plus en Colombie-Britannique si on compare ça à d'autres provinces comme le Nouveau-Brunswick, puis de voir aussi qu'ils ont un système de santé propre aux Premières Nations. Puis j'avais l'impression aussi qu'il y avait vraiment une activité accrue, il y a un changement qui s'opère, et puis les Premières Nations sont vraiment là, puis ils veulent ce changement, puis c'est pas parfait, c'est sûr que la Colombie-Britannique a ses problèmes, mais il y avait aussi beaucoup de groupes qui faisaient tout ce qui est collaboration, recherche, Premières Nations, puis j'avais l'impression qu'il y avait la culture de Premières Nations qui était beaucoup plus mise en avant. Puis la question qui me venait, c'était toujours pourquoi on n'a pas ça au Nouveau-Brunswick? Pourquoi si je pars dans un aéroport, de ne pas voir un mélange de culture puis une intégration de culture? Pourquoi si je descends, je ne vois pas des boutiques qui sont là, de ne pas voir des projets qui sont là, ou bien voir des Premières Nations, des personnes travailler ensemble pour une intégration, puis un travail beaucoup plus collaboratif. Il y a quelqu'un qui me dit que le nombre compte aussi, parce qu'en Colombie-Britannique, on a beaucoup plus de groupes de Premières Nations par rapport au Nouveau-Brunswick. Mais la question que je veux vous poser, c'est qu'est-ce qui empêche vraiment, c'est quoi les défis qui se présentent en tant que Première Nation au Nouveau-Brunswick d'être beaucoup plus aussi active? Vous faites quand même un super beau travail, mais qu'est-ce qui manque pour faire avancer plus ce travail? Et pourquoi est-ce autant si difficile aussi d'avoir un pont qui fait le lien entre vous, le gouvernement, mais aussi avoir des recherches beaucoup plus intégratives qui intègrent la recherche scientifique, mais aussi les savoirs traditionnels comme en Colombie-Britannique. Finalement, c'est quelle approche que la Colombie-Britannique a pris qui fait en sorte que ça réussit beaucoup mieux là-bas et qu'on a vraiment du mal avec l'intégration de ces connaissances traditionnelles lorsqu'on parle de gouvernance ou bien de politique ou bien de recherche même académique sur le terrain. Pourquoi ne pas travailler main dans la main? Puis c'est plus un futur finalement, c'est quel genre de pistes de solutions on peut aussi proposer pour pouvoir arriver plus à un futur où on voit les gens travailler main dans la main pour avoir un travail beaucoup plus collaboratif, mais aussi beaucoup plus culturel. Je parle particulièrement des Premières Nations, mais je parle aussi d'autres cultures au Canada. C'est diversifié, mais il faut que ces cultures s'intègrent quand même ensemble. Pensez-vous, c'est en tout cas de me donner quelques défis qu'on rencontre vraiment au Nouveau-Brunswick qui empêchent vraiment d'avoir ce genre de travail de collaboration qu'on voit beaucoup plus en BC que en tout cas dans la province.
That's a great question. There's a lot to that, and I would thank you for that. So I think the best way I can start that off is that BC, yes, is I've worked with them out there. Yes, the culture is very, very, very much more out in the open. You know, you can see it, and it's beautiful. It's a very ideally, that's, you know, we'd love to have that. But to answer your question is this dates back to a lot of things, and what I see it as is that this comes back to the fact is that New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada is also the birthplace of colonialism in North America. So that right there is a very big hurdle. So a lot of the culture and a lot of the traditions and way of life was banned here, was done to like this. You know, a lot of people don't realize that, you know, some of the first residential schools in Canada were in New Brunswick. And a lot of the culture and a lot of the, you know, the crimes that happened against my people started here at a very early age, the early 1800s. So not only did they make, you know, the government of Canada make it a point to go after the savage, is what they said, to take the Indian out of the Indian. You know, when it comes down to religion and it comes down to government, they both collaborated to get rid of us. So that is still very apparent in the Atlantic Canada region because, like I said, it's the birthplace of colonialism. This is, you know, this is where a lot of the damage was first done. You know, the first use of biological warfare was, you know, on my people. You know, with disease blankets and whatnot, and so there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of mistrust. There's a lot of growth that needs to happen here. I feel in order to create this collaboration and to incorporate the culture more. You know, we're just recently like we've known the stories of, let's say, residential schools and the children being found. We've known of the stories because those are our brothers and sisters. We know the families that had sons and daughters and that didn't come home. So we know these stories. So this goes back to a lot of generational trauma that this region has. So we're developing and trying to get through this. So when the governments, you know, federal and provincial, don't acknowledge that these particular issues happen and they continue to carry on like they do, there's no trust. There's animosity. There's always a wall. There's a double standard for what happens with them and with us. So, you know, I think another clear thing is you look at the current judicial system right now. You look at, you know, Boucher, Chantel Moore, Brady, Rodney Levi, you know, that speaks to how my people are being treated here in this area. So there's a lot of growth and development that needs to happen first before we can exactly, you know, bring out the culture. And we're still trying to find it too, because, you know, religious things have been very predominant in our communities. And only as of recently have we really started to get back into the cultural side of things for us as well. So we're trying to reach back and bring back the culture. And, you know, fortunately, most of us have some of the language still, and that's culture. Like culture is language, because that's how we tell our stories. That's how we do our ceremonies. We sing, we drum. This is how we express ourselves, is through language. And this is how we pass history down. So yeah, there's ways to do this. You have to teach the history. You know, I'm a very big firm believer in reconciling, but reconciling means everybody has to get hurt. Everybody has to get upset. We're all going to get upset about what happened, and we're all going to cry and heal and get mad together. But once that's done, we're all going to know that we're not going to make the same mistake again, because we know what it feels like to hurt, and we know what it feels like to have lived those emotions. So that's my ideal behind it. I think that it would be, you know, teach about what happened in residential schools, teach about Indian agents, teach about kids being, you know, being abused. And because if you don't acknowledge it, you're not providing closure. You're not providing the ability to move on. You're just leaving it and ignoring it and hoping it's going to go away. And it doesn't. It goes from generation to generation, you know, and people don't realize that. Like I'm only a third generation from residential school. You know, people don't understand that. They think residential schools were so long ago. My grandparents went, my parents went. I went to Indian day school, you know, and then my daughter is the first generation that doesn't have to go through something like that. So there's a lot to learn here. There's a lot to go on here, but there's a way that we can all do it, you know, and I feel like it's something that needs to be addressed and moved together. And to me, that's how I feel like that'll be our first steps into, you know, having proper consultation, having, you know, we have the UNDRIP thing coming through. You know, New Brunswick's made it very clear that they're not going to, you know, respect that, which is sad, because it's an opportunity for us to work together. So, you know, with us, we're trying to build those bridges, but it, you know, it comes down to governments. It comes down to who's in charge, you know, and it's, you know, the sad thing is that we're still the ones that vote and put people in charge. So we have to be very vigilant on who we want to appoint as our leaders, right? So that's probably the best way I can express and explain to you what the difference is between BC and here, because a lot of them out there did not actually, they didn't get the full blunt of this colonial style of thinking and the settler style of thinking. And I mean, no disrespect by saying that. This is very historical way of looking at it. I don't like calling people colonizers or settlers. I think it's very abrasive. It's jarring, because it's not true. You know what I mean? Like, people now are born and raised here all their lives, just like we are. So, you know, I feel like that's a hard way of looking at things, but that's the impact of colonialism and that particular movement that happened. So it's still very apparent today, but there's a ways to heal and grow from it. But we all have to do it together, you know, and I feel like there's some places that are worse than others. Like, I know Saskatchewan is a very hard place, like us right now, where they're having difficulties. And it's a lot to move forward through. But like you said, BC has UNDRIP. They've implemented it, but I know that they still have difficulties with it too. I mean, look at the Wet'suwet'en people, who are, you know, the traditional people. They're more, you're looking at traditional chiefs and whatnot. And so, yeah, there's problems with it, but that's how we have to go through it together. Otherwise we'll never fix it. I hope that answers your question.
Beautiful. We only have about 4 or 5 minutes left or so, and there's a doozy of a question in the chat.
Okay.
And so, because the time is a bit short, I'm also wondering if I could ask, so you mentioned MTI, and I'm going to put their website in the chat in a second, once I get a better looking URL. There was another organization you mentioned as well.
WNNB. They're the Wolastoqewi.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the Wolastoqewi. Yeah. They're I work with both of the organizations, and they're both good organizations.
Perfect. So I'll put them in the chat as well. So this question is, some of us, or perhaps many of us, work within colonial legal structures and regimes. What kinds of Mi'kmaq law revitalization projects are happening? how can we make room for and shift our focus to working within these revitalized legal structures and principles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually have the restorative justice right now in the community. That we've been doing it for quite a few years now, and we're one of the few. I think there's about maybe 3 or 4 that have this legal system where they have the sentencing circle and they have this restorative justice, and they try to look at it a little bit more lenient, where they're trying not to have the overrepresentation of our indigenous people in the legal system, and also in the correctional system as well. So there's that particular thing. We're working with the province in Canada, I think, to impose GLADU report writing in the provinces. And then I think there's also court support workers, indigenous court support workers that we've applied for funding for. What we're doing at the lodge for us, it's we're supporting that and moving it through, but what we envision is actually bringing back traditional laws and traditional ways of dealing with this. So getting out of the current judicial system where it's very much non-indigenous focused, where any of our people go in there, it's unfair, it's biased, it's so the best thing for us and what we see is to get out of that system, because it's meant to protect one people and one people only, and it's not ours. So if we can make that system and start being able to have our own laws, our own style of whether it's judges or lawyers or whatnot, and our own traditional laws on how that's going to be implemented and how things are punished. Like, it's not about just sending people to prison. It's about rehabilitating. It's about understanding the trauma. It's about understanding their history, and and being able to work with somebody to make sure that you can help them heal and become a part of the community again, instead of just okay, you're gone, you're banished, or you're going to jail. Like, that's not what it's about. So there's things that are coming up right now that we're doing right now, and there's also things that we're working on at the lodge to look at our own indigenous courts, in our indigenous laws, and having the ability to implement them and have the governance and be able to do that. So there's things that we're working on, but right now the ones that are on the ground right now are the restorative justice, the sentencing circles, and it's got a very unique approach, and it's got a good way to try to get people out of jail and get people to help where they need it. So yeah, so if that answers that, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I see Mike is typing. He would love to speak with you more about the RJ and sentencing circles. This is a great interest of mine, great insights.
Yeah, and I was typing that, but yeah, I really appreciate those insights. That's super interesting, and I would love to chat more about all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a big movement going on for that right now. One of the guys the guy that I actually replaced, Brent Augustine, he was actually directing some of it at one point in time. So I can set you up with the right people to actually talk to about that and get more insight into it. It's a very interesting program. It's very unique. It's been helpful, but they're still, like anything else, they're still going through their glitches and things that they worked out. But I think they've had it for about 10 or 15 years, I think, or maybe even longer. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's a very good program.
And that brings us right up to our break time. So I want to tell you a great big thank you. That was super insightful and very interesting, thought-provoking to listen to. So thank you so much for being there today.
Thank you for having me, guys. I hope this was very helpful. If you want to put my email up there, I mean, if anybody has any questions, by all means, let me know and connect with me. And thank you again for inviting me, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. So we have about 10 minutes for our break. So I will see you back at 2:05. Donc on est prêt à débuter la deuxième partie de notre journée. Susan, I see you're there. Louise, are you there? No?
Hello.
Oh, sorry, I mean Louise Comeau.
Oh, beg your pardon. Too many
I'm
Louises.
so sorry.
Louise is going to speak after me, about 10 minutes after. Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps we can get started. Then we have Susan O'Donnell and Louise Comeau here with us today. We're going to talk to us about energy choices and climate action in New Brunswick. Donc, la parole est à toi, Susan.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. And I want to say, first of all, thank you to the organizers for starting the meeting in such a good way with Chief Ron Tremblay, and then the presentation with Alex Levi. Alex, if you're still there, that was amazing. It was very powerful for me. It gave me a lot to think about. So thanks very much for that. So I'm the leader of the RAVEN project at the University of New Brunswick, and I'm an adjunct research professor in the Environment and Society program at St. Thomas University. And RAVEN is a member of the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. So Louise and I are going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A after we're both finished. I'm the chair of the Energy Caucus, and when I joined in 2018, it had a different name. We changed it to the Energy Caucus earlier this year, when it was called the Just Transition Caucus, and Linnea Astaphan was chair. We produced a publication called Greenprint 2021 that's available on the NBEN website, and I'd encourage you to have a look at it. We can see Greenprint 2021 as a policy document about the energy and ecological transition from the Energy Caucus. And of course, there's a lot of aspects to it. And climate action is just one part of what we're going through. But for climate action, what the priorities are, the main goals are to, first of all, of course, reduce carbon emissions. Second, increase energy conservation. To develop effective public transport and active transport infrastructure, we have to get people out of their personal vehicles, and then supporting the rapid electrification of buildings and vehicles. So basically anything that's using fossil fuel for energy now has to be switched over to electricity. And then in the Greenprint, we said to generate electricity, we have to increase the renewable energy production with the goal of generating 95% of New Brunswick's electricity needs from locally based renewable sources, specifically solar and wind, by 2030. And I just want to mention that the federal government's targets are a 40 to 45% GHG emission reductions below the 2005 levels by 2030, and net zero by 2050. Net zero is a phrase that I'd suggest that you avoid and be suspicious of, because it does not mean zero GHG emissions. We need to say zero, not net zero, and it should be much sooner than 2050. So I'm going to talk for the rest of my time about the context, including the political context in New Brunswick for increasing renewable energy infrastructure to generate electricity, so that more and eventually all of the electrical grid here is powered by renewable energy. So currently for electricity production, we have one provincial public utility, NB Power, and then aside from NB Power, there are 3 municipal utilities. There's only one, St. John Energy, that has a partnership to produce, purchase, and distribute renewable energy. You may have read about the Birchill wind farm that's under construction. When it's operating, hopefully next year, it will produce about 15% of the energy used by customers in St. John. And then there are some privately owned electricity generators, a mix of renewables and fossil fuels. Irving, for example, owns and operates a hydro plant. And then there are 4 or 5 privately owned wind farms and 5 privately owned biomass or gas and cogen plants. But NB Power is by far the biggest player in electricity production in New Brunswick. It's owned and operated by the people of New Brunswick. So anything that's going to happen with our energy future has to involve NB Power in some way. All of NB Power's renewable generation is in hydropower. We own 7 hydro plants. The largest by far is Mactaquac on the St. John River. And NB Power has announced several years ago that Mactaquac will be refurbished at an estimated cost upwards of $3 billion. And then aside from hydropower, all of NB Power's other generation assets are non-renewables. For fossil fuels, NB Power has plants that generate electricity using heavy fuel oil, light fuel oil, coke and pet coke, which is oil refinery waste, and natural gas, also known as fracked gas. Then, of course, NB Power has the Point Lepreau nuclear plant that currently generates about 30% of the electricity used in the province. It was refurbished once and currently has an operating license until 2032. And when it reaches its end of life, if NB Power does not have a replacement for the Lepreau plant, it's possible that it will want to refurbish Lepreau at that time, which will cost at least the same as the Mactaquac refurbishment, upwards of $3 billion. However, NB Power and the New Brunswick government are supporting the development of new nuclear reactors. I'm guessing that most of you heard about small modular nuclear reactors that NB Power is hoping that will replace Point Lepreau, the current Point Lepreau plant. They've not released the costs, but from statements that have been made, it seems the first SMR will cost upwards of $3 billion. So it's really important to understand that NB Power is a nuclear utility, meaning that NB Power believes it has locked itself into nuclear energy, which has the knock-on effect that NB Power does not want to develop renewable energy because nuclear energy and renewable energy do not coexist well within an energy system. The research is very clear on that point. There was an analysis done of 123 countries over 25 years. Nuclear and renewables crowd each other out and limit the effectiveness of both of them. And I'll give an example. So nuclear plants are the most cost-effective when they're running full power all the time. If you need to keep turning a nuclear plant off and on, they're not efficient and the electricity they generate becomes very expensive. Solar panels are the most efficient when the sun is shining, and wind power is the most efficient when the wind is blowing, and when they're not, they have storage as backup. And when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, these renewable sources produce energy much, much more cheaply than a nuclear plant. So if you're trying to run a grid at the lowest cost, ideally you would turn down the nuclear when the sun is shining, for example. But nuclear doesn't want to be turned down because it makes it more expensive, and it doesn't work well as backup for renewables for the same reason. They just don't mix well. So that's one of the many reasons why nuclear and renewables don't mix well. And of course, NB Power knows this, and they've decided that they want to remain a nuclear utility rather than a renewable utility. So they're not at all interested in developing renewable energy and storage. They only want to build new nuclear reactors, which are SMRs. And the big problem as far as climate action is that there's no way that any of the SMRs in development in Canada will be ready by 2030. The most advanced SMR is in Ontario. The two SMR designs for New Brunswick are so far behind and so underdeveloped, we can call them PowerPoint reactors. They will not be able to help us reach our climate targets. Certainly, they will not be producing electricity by 2030, which is what NB Power and the government are claiming about one of them. Not true. Before I continue with what's coming up for climate action, it's also important to know that the big problem NB Power has is its debt. It's about $5 billion in debt, most of which is from the original construction and refurbishment of the Lepreau nuclear plant. And that $5 billion would not be such a big problem if NB Power had sufficient assets. But as I mentioned, its big assets all have problems of their own. The Mactaquac refurbishment, an SMR, another Lepreau refurb will each cost upwards of $3 billion, and it's unclear where the money is going to come from. So I'm just going to say now a little bit about what's coming up, what activists are watching for and advocating for. So again, I'll stress that NB Power is a nuclear utility. They're not interested in developing renewables. And so that's the big struggle right now. Are we going to have a nuclear future in New Brunswick, which is climate action delayed because the new nukes won't be ready in time, or do we want a renewable energy future? It was really an interesting development in July this year. The NB Power board fired its president and CEO, and they put out an ad for a new president and CEO someone who could transform the utility with a focus on renewable energy. And they didn't say anything about expanding the nuclear infrastructure. They've also hired a consultant company to develop a strategic plan. So we're waiting to see what happens next with that. At the same time, NB Power has a very close relationship with the provincial government, and the current Minister of Energy and Natural Resources Development is the main cheerleader for SMRs in the province. And so far, the provincial government has given out 30 million in grants for nuclear development and 0 for renewable development. And early in 2023, so probably within the next 6 weeks or so, the Federal Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, and his team will be coming to New Brunswick for one of the regional energy and resource tables. The federal government is making visits to all the provinces and territories and asking them what their priorities are for climate action. Then the federal government will look at their funding programs and look for money. And the federal government has already given more than 50 million for one nuclear project in New Brunswick. We know that the province is going to ask for more money for nuclear development, and we're concerned because recently the federal government gave the Ontario utility 970 million in what they're calling a low interest loan, which is probably a grant, 970 million in Ontario to develop an SMR. And that was from the Federal Infrastructure Bank. So as I said, the big struggle right now as far as climate action in the province is deciding if it's going to be a nuclear future, which actually delays climate action because the new nuclears won't be ready in time, or are we going to go for renewable energy? There are many environmental groups fighting for a renewable energy future. Many are NBEN members. And as far as I'm aware, there's only 2 environmental groups in the province supporting nuclear energy expansion. In closing, the Energy Caucus is planning to develop resources for environmental groups in New Brunswick about energy choices for the future. If your group is interested to learn more about different energy choices or anything else related to energy in New Brunswick, please get in touch. That's all I have to say, and I'm going to turn it over to Louise. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Oh, Louise, you're there. Perfect.
Yeah, I'm here. Anna, can I share the screen for a sec? Is that possible?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
I'll just do that and maybe share a slide or 2. Let me just make sure it's sitting here in front of me. Hold on a sec. So that I've got the one I want to show you. Okay, so now that should be there. So maybe we can start with just a quick to build on what Susan's saying. Let me just put this into slideshow current. Okay, so let me start with kind of reinforcing some of the points. You know, we talk about what we want, but in some ways, I think what matters more is what do the people want. And the people have 2 kind of dimensions that I think are important here. One is, what do they think at a high level? And then what do they think when a particular project comes to town? In the context of my work at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, and in my role as Director of Climate Solutions, Climate Change Solutions, we look at and research both those dimensions in terms of understanding the people and understanding particular projects. In this case, what you're looking at is a survey we did not that long ago. I can't even remember what day it is. We're in December. It was probably in September, October, so quite recently. And we asked people across Canada to tell us what they preferred in terms of sources of energy. And I want to show you this because this is the New Brunswick results. I'll show you a little one that compares it with other provinces. But the key thing is that the answers that come back are always the same. But perhaps some nuance here that you might find interesting and important. These are the results for the options of strongly support, or slightly support. And I'm showing you here in the blue the support and strongly support, but I added the slightly support because it really matters in terms of where we think we can bring people into a conversation that may not yet be paying attention. And so what we see is a couple of things I want to point out. The first thing is that people do prefer solar. And this came out in focus groups we've done across the country. They feel that they're less intrusive and more democratic. And often we end up talking about wind. And I think in terms of energy democracy thinking, the solar piece is kind of important. The second thing is that wind comes second, and then efficiency, which is, I find interesting, but this big slightly support in New Brunswick, which is different than anywhere else in the country, followed by hydro. I want to point out, just following up on Susan's comment, we see SMRs at 34% strongly support, 6% slightly support. That's the highest level in the country. So just to point that out to you, it's small relative to the others, but it is a big number relative to the country. And I think one where it suggests more information is required. But in terms of challenges that we have with the electricity system and the future energy system, if it's going to be more electrified, it is a discussion about the electricity system, is that everything to the right of hydro is what the province is pushing at a political and utility level. And everything to the left is what the people want. And so I want to point out that we not only have challenges around positioning for SMRs, which I see as a threat, but in the longer term, in the short term, I actually see biomass as potentially an even more serious near-term threat, because there's discussions of whether or not it could be used at the Belgian plant. And we've got this discussion of Atlantic Loop, which is about connecting interprovincially to bring in hydro from Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'll point out to the second to last bar that some of the lowest support for options is in fact this question of imports. And it's a very important question, because people want not just the renewables, they want renewables generated in our province by New Brunswickers for New Brunswickers. So I just will stop sharing at that point, just to kind of set that context for you, that this is where the people are at. However, it won't take, if folks have been exposed to our work on the wind energy project research that we did in Northern New Brunswick, and I'll put the link to that in case you or anyone happen to be that last person on earth who hasn't heard of this work yet. I'll just put that in here. There's everything there, reports and webinars and videos and whatever. But it's okay for us, and it's important for us to support certain things, but it's also important to listen to the people in terms of what happens when projects try to get into communities. And we've had two important failures in Northern New Brunswick around wind projects that I think speak to the need for us to do some very hard work around ensuring that we're seen to be defending not just energy democracy in the sense of community ownership as being an option on the table, but also questions of process justice and distributional justice, and the process of doing things in a way that build trust in communities, so that communities are willing to accept projects. And one of the things we really failed to do is to have people involved at the level of, for example, project design, project development, thinking about siting. We're not involved in involving people that way. So both of those things I want to share with you, really to set the policy context, and then I'll quickly end. We have a few things that I think represent important opportunities here in New Brunswick in the next year to two, leading up to the next provincial election and federal election. The first one is that the most recent climate plan committed to developing a clean electricity strategy for the province. The fact is that you may have also heard the Premier's created an energy secretariat. From the Premier's point of view, it's not just SMRs that he thinks make a clean electricity strategy. He thinks that's LNG and lifting the shale gas moratorium as well. Biomass you can throw in there, hydrogen's in there. So we got a lot of things that are in the idea or in the minds of Wayne. I just love this. How do you appoint a guy to be in charge of the energy secretariat in the Premier's office, and his name is Wayne Power? I just think that just gives me all more sorts of things I want to play with. So we have to really fight to be part of this process, and CCMB's certainly been working on that. We want to bring others involved in that, but that means we do need to present more articulate our own idea of what a clean electricity strategy should look like for the province. We'll be doing that. We'd like to see Energy Caucus be working on things like that. It's including some modeling that we've been waiting for a long time. We did some initial modeling looking at what New Brunswick's electricity system could look like. It had a bit too much trade in it that we went back and redid it. So it's coming back in I think something that makes more sense for us given what we want and what the people want. But we also have federal components here that I'll just point out. And the big one I want to share with you that I think does help us if we can get implementation to not be delayed. Obviously, the coal phase out reg in 2030, which is a federal regulation that is designed to get coal out of the system. We can't have any delay in that. The province is trying to delay that, saying, you know, wait for the nukes, wait for the nukes. No, that's got to happen in 2030, and renewables are their option if we don't get biomass in there, which I don't consider in this case renewable. It's great for heating. I don't think it's good for electricity. The second thing, though, is the federal government is also proposing a clean electricity regulation that would essentially move out all the fossils by 2035. All of that's coming down the pipe in the new year. Over the next year, we'll be heavily involved in all of that. And it too must succeed, because if it succeeds, then we can force the redesign of our electricity system that essentially needs renewables and storage in the short term, because the other stuff isn't going to be there. And the reason I put all that out there, and I know for many of you, I've jumped into a conversation that is a conversation that I have all the time that isn't as familiar to you all, so I apologize for that. But the reason I mentioned these things, what people want, our own humility in terms of listening to people in communities to ensure projects can happen, and essentially driving federal action to force the province to do things early in order not to have the crazy things we don't want. I say all of that because electrification to solve climate change suggests an electricity system that grows, even with massive investment in efficiency, probably double the size that we have today. Other models sometimes suggest 3 times, which I think is ridiculous. You know, we need not to fall for the growth paradigm. So I think that it's important that we think about this fact that this is a growing sector, and it has to be done right. It has to be done cleanly, but it has to be done with people in mind. And so the next year is going to be an area or a time, if folks are interested in this topic, then we've obviously got lots of work to do. So why don't I just stop it there?
I see one question. I don't know if you want me to just go right into it. It was directed to me. With
yes, sorry, Susan. Oh yeah, if you're going to read the question, that's perfect. We just want to make sure it gets interpreted. Thank you.
With adequate government funding, is a renewable future possible by 2030? I'll say a few things, and then I think Louise might want to jump in on this. In the green print, we had a lot of discussion about this, and we came up with 95%, because that last 5% is peaking power, and it would be, after 95%, it gets a lot more expensive to do that last 5%. So we went for 95% by 2030, thinking that 5% could come a few years later, but 95%. In terms of adequate government funding, there are models, like you may be familiar with Chris Rose's model, for example, where he talks about, if you actually, instead of with the carbon fund, if you look at what our government's doing now with the carbon fund, they're not only funding small modular reactors, they're funding all kinds of pet projects that have very little to do with, anyway, that's, I'm getting, but if we directed that money, for example, to renewable energy generation infrastructure, we could do a lot with that money that's coming back into the province from the federal government that belongs to New Brunswickers. So yes, I would say it's possible. And Louise, you may have something to say about this.
Yeah, I would say actually that there's a lot of wishful thinking that goes on in this discussion. It may be technically possible, but I'm not sure it's socially possible. So this is my concern, that if we don't engage people in this conversation and make them feel part of an energy transition, and that this is a solution that they want, if we don't address energy poverty and energy affordability issues, because no matter what we do, if we're investing a lot in a new electricity system, even if we're replacing existing and try to limit growth, it's a lot of investment. We got to make sure that's not happening on the backs of ratepayers. It's got to be some taxpayer funded, as Susan was talking about, but there will be increased spending on electricity, even if your household energy bill, because you're not spending as much on gasoline, goes down. This is a hard thing to explain. We have a lot ahead of us here. And I think a lot of the work that we do is too focused on technology issues and not enough on the social side of it. And so that's, I think, until we get beyond that and get into, okay, how do we engage people? How do we deal with the fact that people don't feel they're being given a choice in where projects grow and how they're sited and how they're built and what community benefits there are. So for CC&B, we're working not just on the system stuff and the regulation stuff, but we're also working on a campaign around energy poverty because we've got to ramp up efficiency. We've ramp up low to moderate income household programs. We've got to make sure that people spend as little as possible on energy at the same time that there's a massive investment going on. So I guess my challenge to us all is we can model ourselves to death here and say, yeah, it's possible. But I do believe we are engaged in a lot of wishful thinking. So is it possible?
Thank
Maybe
you.
with some hard work that isn't about nuts and bolts.
Oh, I see there's a, oh, there you go, Zoe, go ahead.
Sorry. Just getting everything sorted here. Yeah, the question in the chat is, oh my goodness, my screen just minimized without my consent. Here we go. Nous intervenons souvent au niveau de la ville de Moncton pour leur demander à démarrer enfin le grand plan de panneaux solaires qu'ils ont prêt depuis au moins 6 ans. Mais nous sommes toujours confrontés au fait qu'ils disent qu'ils ne peuvent pas aller de l'avant en raison de énergie power, NB power. I don't know how to say énergie NB. Quelle modification à la loi provinciale faut-il demander pour que cela soit possible pour les villes et les grandes institutions, universités, hôpitaux, etc., de démarrer vraiment ces grands plan solaire maintenant?
I'm just going to start, but I think Louise is best placed to answer that. But I'll just say that the answer to this question is a lot more complex than it seems, because there's some big questions that we also have to discuss about the extent to which we want to have private ownership within our public utility. And I won't get into that, but just saying that it's a difficult question to make sure that we roll out electricity in a way that we're not going to have some people who have a lot of money paying less for their electricity than people who can't afford it. And we have a system that gets degraded, and a system for the poor people and another situation for the wealthy people. So that's one of the big questions that we have to, it doesn't answer your question directly, but I'm just saying it's a little more complicated than that. Louise?
So the province has a commitment to 40% of its supply coming from what it calls renewables, and it includes hydro from Mactaquac and so on. So it's only 7% of our power comes from wind, insignificant amount from solar. So we do need to increase that target. It should be increased significantly. I'd say double it. And then there is the question of what kind of power are we securing? So in this case, it could be a community-owned, community-operated solar farm. That's happening in Nova Scotia, for example. It could be on individual household roofs. It could be collectively owned. They could be leased. There's lots of ways that we can do it. But the key thing is that NB Power doesn't need the power unless the target increases. There's the embedded generation program where people have been able to get at least the credit system once their bills, positives and negatives over the course of a year, but then they don't get paid at the end of the year. It just gets netted out. Those things are all programmatic changes that we need. But I would say that I think there's some change coming. I think the recent increase in fossil fuel prices and the fact that the utilities facing an 8.9% rate increase, primarily due to fossil fuel price increases, has opened the door to the possibilities of more renewables coming onto the system. So it's time to drive an EV train through that one, I think, or something. Because I think there's an opportunity there in the short term. So that's the block as I understand it. There may be others who have different views, but that's how I understand it.
I know that we could go on about this all day, but I believe we're out of time, Anika. Yeah. So there's a great question about geothermals in the chat, and we might be able to just kind of continue to have that conversation in the chat as we move on with the next guest. Thank you so much to you both. It's fascinating.
Merci Susan et merci Louise. Je vais passer maintenant la parole à Mike Kofahl de East Coast Environmental Law. So Mike, the floor is yours.
Great, and I'm just going to share my screen here. I do have a PowerPoint presentation. And I'm going to be talking, oh, that's the end of the thing here is in the way, so I'm just trying to start. There we go.
There you go, you're all
Yeah,
set.
so I'm going to be talking a little bit about coastal law and policy and how it relates to environmental and climate justice. My name is Mike, and I'm a staff lawyer at East Coast Environmental Law. I just want to acknowledge that I am coming to you today from unceded, traditional, and unsurrendered territory of Mi'kmaq in Unama'ki, which is in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And just a bit about us: we're an environmental law charity who does environmental law and specifically public interest environmental law throughout the Atlantic region. And you can find more about us on our website. So I'm just going to be chatting today for about 20 minutes, and then I'll leave some room for conversation and questions. But I'm going to be talking about coastal law and policy, the way that climate change impacts the coast, and providing some remarks on where we stand right now in terms of coastal law and policy and environmental and climate change justice. So I thought I would start by just chatting a little bit about this kind of question of why focus on the coast? You know, I imagine that most people here already have a pretty strong understanding of why our coasts are so important, but I thought it would be a good place to start. The coasts provide a ton of very important and specific ecosystem services and functions, which I'll chat a little bit more about. And it also is really important because it provides unique ecosystems for species and habitats for species and for humans who live along the coast. And in fact, most people live pretty close to the coast. So this is the maritime ringlet. It is an endangered species, and it is endemic to New Brunswick, which means that it only lives in New Brunswick, and it actually is found almost exclusively in salt marshes in New Brunswick. So it's a very coastal species, and because it lives in basically exclusively in coastal ecosystem, it's really important that we not only protect the species, but we protect the ecosystem that it lives and thrives in. Because without that ecosystem, it's not going to be around for very much longer. So I want to talk a little bit about climate change and talk a little bit about some of the IPCC reports that have come out recently. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's internationally recognized for its work on climate change that's caused by humans. It's the IPCC is made of 195 member states, which is pretty much all of the states in the world. There's very few that are not part of it. And it has a panel or a bureau of scientists who conduct a number of assessments, and they do these in assessment cycles. And right now we're on assessment cycle 6. And the work is really done by kind of 3 working groups. The first working group focuses on kind of the physical scientists, the science behind climate change. The second working group looks at climate change impacts and ways we can adapt. And the third working group discusses and assesses mitigation of climate change, and specifically focused on greenhouse gas emission reductions. And they released 3 reports within about the last year and a half to this year that really focused on providing some insights into where we are right now with climate change. The first one last year, I believe it was in August, basically was a pretty stark warning that we need to act now. We're in a code red. A lot of people are being affected. There's changes that we're seeing that we haven't seen for thousands of years, and some, for example, sea level rise, are basically irreversible in the next thousands of years. The second report that came out at the beginning of this year identified various things. So climate change impacts are really at the high end of estimates where people had predicted they would be, and we're facing unavoidable consequences as a result. For instance, over 1 billion people will face flooding due to sea level rise, and those impacts are going to be felt the greatest along the coast and people and communities living along the coast. Wow, I feel like I'm being kind of a bummer here. The final report that also came out in April of this year basically said that it's basically going to be impossible to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius without immediate and deep cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to have to give some attention to carbon dioxide removal, which can include all kinds of different things, including blue carbon management and restoration of peatlands. This is really important to the coastal environment specifically because blue carbon is basically dependent on blue carbon ecosystems, which are coastal ecosystems or marine ecosystems. So there's kind of 3 broad categories of blue carbon ecosystems: salt marshes, seagrass meadows, and mangroves. And we have 2 of those, the seagrass meadows and salt marshes in New Brunswick. And basically what they do is they take carbon out of they take carbon and they sequester it, or they produce it in their root systems and their plant structures, and they sequester it in the subsoil in those ecosystems, similar to the way peatlands work. And so this is a really important ecosystem function that our coastal salt marshes and seagrass meadows have. There's also special reports that the IPCC creates, and these are really on topics that are suggested to them by governments and by observer organizations. And one of them, released in 2019, talks about the impacts of climate change on the oceans and cryosphere, so areas of the environment that are frozen or covered in ice. And so a number, and these are all found in the summary to the report. I haven't read the full report, it's quite lengthy. But some of the key things and that are specifically related to coast are the fact that climate change is going to increase storm surge. We're going to have extremely high waves. We're going to have extreme sea level rise. We're going to have more prevalent and severe coastal erosion and coastal flooding. We're going to see decreases in catches for fish, which will compound with other impacts that we're seeing related to overfishing and depletion of fish stocks. We're going to see impacts from saltwater. For instance, saltwater intrusion in the estuaries will actually push other marine species and other species that are dependent on freshwater further inland and displace those species and have a cascading effect on terrestrial species. There's also impacts from saltwater on things like drinking water and drinking wells, among many other impacts. As I said, impacts on fish will have impacts on economic benefits and on the livelihood of local communities and indigenous communities that really depend on those. And these will be prevalent in very different areas around the globe, including North American communities, and especially on the eastern seaboard. We're also going to see biodiversity loss and habitat loss. For example, there's a high confidence that by 2100, we're going to have lost between 20 and 90% of our coastal wetlands, which is just absolutely absurd. And there are obviously other risks for communities like health and safety benefit risks. For example, there'll be elevated pollutants and mercury in marine plants and animals that we then eat, and communities that are really reliant on consuming seafood will actually be at an increased risk. Now, the report also identified the importance and the services and functions that these coastal ecosystems provide right now, and that folks are starting to recognize more and more. So, for instance, protecting the coastline from storms and erosion, and helping to buffer against the impacts of sea level rise. And some measures are taken, including hard armoring, diking and seawalling, and creating barriers between the land and the coast. There's also a lot of efforts to have programs where there's living shorelines. So obviously, our coasts are really important in New Brunswick. They provide really important ecosystem services that really help to protect us and help us adapt to climate change, but also serve functions like carbon sequestering that help us to mitigate climate change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the law now, and I know that's a super exciting topic, and there's tons of laws out there that deal with all kinds of different coastal issues and matters, and I'm really going to focus on coastal development laws and policies that dictate that, because I just don't have enough time to talk about it all. There's no single law in New Brunswick. There's no single law at the federal level that deals with the coast as an entire entity or an entire part of the environment. What we generally are left with is various kinds of environmental laws or other laws that deal with aspects that can be applied to coastal developments or applied to coastal matters. So I'm going to talk, I've identified some federal laws here. So the Fisheries Act, Navigable Waters Act, Species at Risk Act, and Migratory Birds Convention Act. There are other federal laws that deal with coastal development and coastal issues, but these are the main ones. And basically what these do at the federal level is create licensing or permitting or approval systems where if you're a project on the coastal environment or in the coastal waters will disrupt fish or impair navigation or have impacts on species at risk or migratory birds, then you'll need an approval. But generally, those projects receive those approvals. So not a great way of dealing with those impacts. And it's very similar at the provincial level. And there's tons of different laws that have varying kinds of implications for coastal development. These are the main ones. So the Clean Environment Act has varying kinds of provisions in it. So the water quality regulation prohibits release of contaminants into the environment unless you have an approval. Approvals are often provided, usually with conditions and terms. There's an environmental impact assessment at the provincial level, as well as a similar one at the federal level, which again create licensing regimes or approval processes for projects. There's the Clean Water Act at the provincial level, and this is a big one. It creates a permitting system for any kind of project or activity that will alter either water courses and wetlands. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. I will note that water courses as defined don't actually include the ocean. So there's been some practice in New Brunswick where this actually doesn't apply to ocean or coastal areas. So that can be very problematic. The Clean Water Act also prohibits the release of contaminants into water in certain circumstances, including if it affects the quality of the water, will it potentially endanger health or safety of persons or animals, cause damage, or interfere with properties. And a contaminant can be pretty broad in the sense of what it might capture, but it always includes pesticides and waste. And again, you can release a contaminant into water if you have permission. So not necessarily a great system. And then finally, the Crown Lands and Forests Act applies. Pretty much all of the coast from the low water mark to the high water mark in New Brunswick is considered provincial crown land. And so on those provincial crown lands, which are usually submerged, you cannot conduct a project or activity unless you have a permit or lease for that project or activity. So this is a really important one. There's also various kinds of policy that deal with coastal development and other coastal issues. And I've listed some of them here. There are others, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. So the first one is the Coastal Areas Protection Policy for New Brunswick. I love the title. And the primary piece to this is that it creates 2 protection zones around the coast. So the first protection zone is called Zone A. Again, great description for that. And this applies between the low water mark and the high water mark around the province. So that provincial submerged crown land. It also includes any of the ecosystems that are in that, as well as extends beyond to any kind of dune systems that are attached to that. And in this zone, you're really not allowed to do a whole lot. There's very few activities that are allowed, and they include kind of more minor projects or smaller projects, like activities that are for research or education or habitat management, some erosion control structures, except in salt marshes or other coastal wetlands. And then there is a Zone B, and a Zone B applies from the edge of that Zone A. I actually have maps here I'd forgotten about. And Zone B applies just above that initial zone, 30 meters in. So it's an additional buffer zone, and some activities are allowed in that zone that aren't allowed in Zone A. There are some activities that are not allowed pursuant to this policy in either zone, and those include infilling, dredging, beach quarrying, causeway construction if there's no alternatives, and groins. So this is a pretty important policy, and it's unfortunate because it is implemented through the wetland and watercourse permitting process. So the way it's produced and the way it's managed and governed is through that permitting process. But that's problematic if you have a permit or an approval that's required on some other legislation or through another regulation, because it's not necessarily immediately captured, which can be problematic. There's kind of a scattered process to using it. The second one I want to talk about is the new Climate Change Action Plan. And the reason I want to talk about it is because it doesn't really mention the coast a whole lot, and there's definitely some gaps in terms of how it can contribute to stronger and more resilient coasts in relation to adapting and mitigating against climate change. And so there's 3 pillars to this coastal policy or to this climate change action plan: government leadership and accountability, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and preparing for climate change. I went through it, and there really aren't many actions, and there's a total of kind of 30 actions that the government has suggested that they're going to take. And I could dispute that and say that some are not necessarily actions and some are duplicated, but that probably wouldn't be very helpful. But there are 3 that do have some bearing on protecting the coast or conserving the coast. The first one is Action 15. So we're about halfway through the policy or halfway through the plan. And this Action 15 suggests that by 2025, the government will develop and implement an agricultural climate change strategy, including by identifying opportunities to reduce emissions from agriculture and to enhance carbon sinks. So this potentially applies to the coast, because if you have agriculture going right up to the coast, agriculture occurring in wetlands or in coastal marshes, those activities generally aren't excluded from those areas. They're not prohibited in that coastal zone. So this can be problematic, and there's potential for us and the province to identify those carbon sinks. So for example, those salt marshes, and try to give them more protection than they currently have. Action 16 is to improve understanding and increase carbon sink stocks, and partially by developing and beginning to implement an assessment tool to quantify carbon stocks of the province's wetlands by 2026. So this is a plan to have a plan. And then a regular tracking and reporting by 2030. So in 8 years or so, we'll have a sense of how our carbon stocks in New Brunswick are doing. And so I would suggest that this is a pretty delayed reaction, and not really the immediate reaction response that the IPCC is suggesting we need to take in order to prevent any further catastrophic impacts from climate change. And then the last action, action 30, is to implement a living shorelines program by 2026. And I think this could potentially be really positive. And that is currently in the control of the Department of Environment and Climate Change. And so kind of coming back to my theme about and thinking about environmental and climate change, I guess I would pose the question, do the environmental laws and the policies in New Brunswick that are relevant, do they actually contribute to environmental climate change? So do they help us implement Indigenous rights and make space for Indigenous laws? Well, there's not much mention of Indigenous rights or Indigenous laws in any of those policies or laws. So I would probably say no. Do they help us eliminate environmental racism? Well, probably not. They don't talk about environmental racism. They don't talk about equity. So I would say no. Do they help us address biodiversity loss, climate change, or global pollution? Well, there are some provisions that deal indirectly with climate change, but there's not a great deal that actually, and very strong tools that help us deal with any of these. There's some provisions that are meant to address some of those things, but there's not really any concrete actions or concrete provisions that do that. Do they help us protect communities that are most vulnerable? And I would say this also applies to future generations. Are there instances where decision-making is meant to help us protect future communities and future generations? So they're not burdened by all of these climate decisions and climate harms that we're doing right now. There isn't much mention of future generations. There's often not many processes that people can become engaged in these decision-making processes. So for example, for wetlands or coastal projects, there's not a whole lot of input from communities living in those areas or from Indigenous groups who have rights in those areas. So again, this is not a no. I think they somewhat help us, but not to a great extent. Do they help us transition equitably away from the use of fossil fuels? Well, there's no provision in any of these laws that would facilitate or explicitly facilitate the use of fossil fuels. But they're not exactly helping us transition away from those either. And so I had mentioned peat land and peat harvesting. This is one of those activities that happens in New Brunswick. It's one of the few provinces that still has a ton of peat harvesting and exploitation. This is one of those things that would help us transition away from certain types of uses and these kind of one-time uses. So I think outside of just fossil fuels, like other kind of one use and done resources, peatlands would be, and peat would be one of those. Do they respect the rights of future generations? I think the answer to that is no. There's really no mention of future generations. And do they recognize the value of the natural world and its biodiversity? And again, I would say there is some recognition of the value and the services and functions that ecosystems provide to humans, but there's really no recognition of the inherent value of the natural world as its own entity. And there's not a ton of provision that really is meant to protect biodiversity in those coastal areas. I don't know what I'm doing for time here. Maybe I'll end it. I was going to talk briefly about the New Brunswick Environmental Bill of Rights that was proposed, but I don't think I have time for that. So I will leave it at that and stop sharing.
Merci, Mike. On a 6 minutes pour des questions. Sentez-vous libre de lever la main, de le mettre dans le chat. Marika.
Oh yes, thank you, Mike. That was an excellent presentation. I guess it begs the question, all your questions beg another question, like when we I work for a watershed organization, so we're actually looking at the water strategy, but it applies to these other coastal documents that you've shown us. Like, is the government primarily interested in regulation and less in leadership and environmental leadership in specific? And you know, how can we address that huge gap in environmental leadership in our province?
Yeah, that is a tough question. I don't think I have a simple answer for it. I mean, I definitely think that there are mechanisms where it's not so much about leadership, but it really is about regulating and having certain projects go through a process that ends up being a permit or approval. I would say one place to focus is those policies. I mean, some of those laws that I talked about are like 30, 40 years old. So I don't know if there's any interest in changing them. There hasn't been for a while now. But those policies really do help dictate and shape the way decisions are made under those laws and those regulations. And they're a little bit easier to change. I think they're the type of thing that you can focus on and try to shift that. It's a little bit easier for the government to say, okay, we'll take another look at this. So focusing on some of those policies and really participating in that law reform process and engaging when there are opportunities. I know, and I imagine a lot of folks were engaged in the climate change action plan process. So engaging in those types of process and really trying to push for stronger public engagement. Because at the end of the day, if you know, if government isn't listening to the people who are living in these experiences, living along the coast as an example, and experiencing that storm surge, experiencing that coastal flooding, seeing salt water in their drinking water, if they're not listening and hearing those stories, they're not going to act on those issues. And I mean, participate and vote, use your voice, use those tools that you have, I guess there. But yeah.
Thank you. The next question is there any protection in mining laws, federal or provincial?
Protection in mining laws. There are not many that I know of. I would say that if there's going to be a mine in a coastal area or a quarry, probably the best place that those issues would be addressed are like through the provincial environmental impact assessment or the federal impact assessment, although that generally doesn't happen in New Brunswick. It's usually a provincial process. That'll be likely the best place that you would find some of that. Now, those projects usually undergo a determination review and then they're released, so they're not the best process. In terms of that like smaller approval process, yeah, you would need an approval for water course or wetland alteration. You're not allowed to mine within that coastal area, so I guess there's indirect protections, but they're not in any kind of mining legislation that I'm aware of.
Merci. La prochaine question est en français. Je crois que c'est le dernier qu'on a le temps. Pour quand on a le temps. La question c'est, pensez-vous que la réforme de la LCCPE va être utile? I think in English it's CEPA/BS5 pour la protection des côtes.
Sorry, and I'm not familiar with that. Are you talking about the reform under CEPA, the Federal Canadian Environmental Protection Act? There.
Yeah, I believe that's what they're talking about.
So the Canadian Environmental Protection Act largely applies to toxic substances. So there's a toxic substance list, and there's various substances that are listed in that, and you need an approval if you're going to be using those or selling them, etc. And from what I understand, there's some part of the reform will talk about environmental rights, which would be a step in the right direction. But Outside of the application of the Act of those toxic substances that are listed, it doesn't usually have very broad application for general projects. So unless a project is using one of those toxic substances, it probably won't have a ton of relevance for like smaller coastal projects, as an example, like a wetland alteration. So in principle, it's really good to see a step towards those recognition of environmental rights, but in practice, probably won't lead to a lot of change.
Perfect, thank you. I think that brings us up to time.
Oui, merci, Mike. Thank you, Mike, so much for your presentation. I hope you'll join us for the rest of the day as well. J'espère que tu vas te joindre à nous pour le reste de la journée. Donc, on a une autre pause de 10 minutes. C'est la dernière pause de la journée. Puis, ça va être l'AGA. Donc, j'aimerais inviter les groupes membres et associés à se joindre à nous pour l'AGA. C'est très important pour qu'on puisse avoir le quorum. Mais si vous nous quittez après la pause, merci d'avoir été ici. Et sinon, de retour à 3h15. Merci tout le monde.